Hello, I'm David Randall, Director of Research for the National Association of Scholars. And the National Association of Scholars is delighted to host the latest in its series of webinars on American history. We've been going chronologically from 1620 onwards. We did 1815 in the Battle of New Orleans last, and now we are up to 1820, the Missouri Compromise and its legacy. The fire bell portending perhaps the Civil War some decades later. Now, I am delighted to have here three speakers, Dr. Paul Finkelman, Dr. Craig Hammond, and Dr. Jeff Pasley. Dr. Paul Finkelman is president of Gratz College in Pennsylvania, and the President William McKinley Distinguished Professor of Law and Public Policy Emeritus at Albany Law School. Dr. Craig Hammond, John Craig Hammond, is Associate Professor of History at Penn State University, New Kensington. Dr. Jeff Pasley is Professor of History and Associate Director of the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy at the University of Missouri. Now, we've invited them because they all have a distinguished publication record on the 1820 Missouri Compromise. In the comments below in chat, you will see a great many of their publications. They're already there with links to follow to them. We encourage you to buy as many of their books as possible. Now, what we will be doing is having each of them speak for perhaps 12 to 14 minutes in alphabetical order by last name, President Finkelman, Professor Hammond, Professor Pasley, in that order. There will then be a directed, moderated conversation, perhaps something they say will make other people want to speak, and above all, your comments, the questions and answers from the audience. You can use either the chat button or the Q&A button. Please put in comments. Either the panelists will respond directly or I will pass on their questions or comments, not in chronological order, just in whatever seems interesting to forward the conversation. Any questions or comments that you have not had answered by the end of the 90 minutes, please send to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I will then forward them to the panelists, at least one of whom has already put his email address anyway into the chat comment. But the point is, all questions will be answered. This will be recorded within 24 hours. Everyone will have the opportunity to see it for perpetuity. And on that note, I'm going to go President Finkelman.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be with all of you today. And I am delighted to be part of this program. So I've been thinking about the Missouri Compromise since I was asked to be on this. Obviously, as somebody who's been teaching American history for more decades than I'm ready to admit, I have taught about the Missouri Compromise, thought about it a lot. But a couple of years ago, I published a new book called Supreme Injustice, Slavery in the Nation's Highest Court. And I have an entire chapter dealing with Justice Joseph Story and his relationship to slavery. And oddly enough, Story's career intersects with the Missouri Compromise in an important way. Shortly before Story went on the bench, he became enamored with Virginia. He idolized Virginia. He idealized Virginia as well. He claimed that he was really a Virginian at bottom because of the climb was more congenial with my nature than the petty prejudice and sullen coolness of New England, which he said was bigoted in opinion. And he made reference to the Salem witch trials, and he also, of course, was attacking New England because New England had suggested that the Union might be dissolved during the War of 1812. Of course, there was a very small number of radical New Englanders who were basically castigated by everybody else in the region for the Hartford Convention, but it certainly annoyed Story. And so Story goes on the court, put there by James Madison, who is, of course, a Jeffersonian Virginian. And Story doesn't say much about sectional issues or slavery in his first years on the court. But gradually he comes to understand that the Virginians may not be as idealized as he thought. And then comes the Missouri debates. In December 1819, in his hometown of Salem, Massachusetts, Story forcefully and publicly opposed the admission of Missouri as a slave state and emphatically endorsed a resolution that it was the duty of the government to prevent the extension of so great a political and moral evil as slavery, and that prohibiting new slave states was both constitutional and expedient, and that it was in, quote, the spirit of the Constitution, the principles of free government, the tenor of the Declaration of Independence, and the dictates of humanity and sound policy. And he castigated the members of the Massachusetts delegation in Congress, said that they were faint-hearted, they were weak, and they were following a vacillating policy when they endorsed allowing Maine to come in as a free state because it meant Missouri was coming in as a slave state. And so when we think about the Missouri Compromise at this point, it is seen, at least by Northerners, as a pro-slavery event. And it is seen as a loss to opponents of slavery, a loss to people who favor freedom. And by the way, nobody in the North at this time is arguing for a direct emancipation of all slaves. At least there are no organizations like that. There may be a few individuals, but most people in the North are simply arguing that it is time to put a stop to this ridiculous spread of slavery further west. Now is the time to stop it so that eventually, at some point in American history, slavery will come to an end. Lincoln will express this when he says that slavery needs to be put on the road of ultimate extinction. Of course, the Missouri Compromise passes. It passes with a coalition of moderate Southerners and most Northerners, but not all Northerners, and certainly not all radical Southerners. It's a kind of odd vote. But the Missouri Compromise in 1820-21 has to be seen as a great pro-slavery victory, because although it is silly to argue that the Northwest Ordinance Line travels across the Mississippi into Missouri as a matter of law, it is not silly to argue that as a matter of a political statement and a cultural statement. The nation had said in 1787, and by the way, it is repassed after the Constitution is ratified and Congress repasses the Northwest Ordinance. The nation has essentially said, this is the line. No slavery north of the southern boundary of the Ohio River, which would preclude slavery in Missouri. Again, the proposal to not have slavery in Missouri doesn't free all the slaves. It simply says no more slaves. Slavery will eventually die out. Missouri will eventually become a free state. What happens in the next 25 years or so is fascinating, because as the nation fills in, we begin to see a kind of pairing off. Now, it is never directly pairing off the way we think of the Missouri Compromise. A compromise will let Maine in, will let Missouri in. On the contrary, it's kind of hit or miss. And for a while in the early 1840s, the South actually has two more states because Florida and Texas enter the Union. And so it has two more states than the North has. But nobody imagines that this senatorial majority of the South is going to lead to an attack on freedom. After all, presumably with the Senate majority, Southerners could have prevented any more free states from coming into the Union because they could always block it in the Senate. And this would, of course, lead to a constitutional crisis. But this doesn't happen. And in fact, two more northern states enter the Union in the late 1840s, and we're back to parity. And this parity would eventually have ended had it not been for the Mexican War. Because while in theory Texas could be subdivided into another four states, nobody at least no white people, no Americans lived in most of Texas. It was mostly uninhabitable. In fact, some would argue it still is mostly uninhabitable, although I know that one of our moderators here is from Texas. Nobody wanted to live in the Permian Basin or in the vast desert between San Antonio and El Paso. And so there's no expectation that Texas will become a bunch of states. And therefore, absent the Mexican War, if Texas remains in the United States, eventually that swath of the upper Midwest is going to lead to a majority of free states. Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, Oregon, Idaho, Washington State, all will become free states, and you will have your free state majority. So the weirdness is that by the 1840s, the Missouri Compromise is probably understood by most Northerners as something that's going to eventually preserve freedom. And that's one of the reasons why Southerners need the Mexican War. It's one of the reasons why James Polk of Tennessee, a slave owner, wants the Mexican War. He wants more territory for the South. And so the opposition to the Mexican War by opponents of slavery is weirdly rooted in the Missouri Compromise, which they would have opposed 25 years earlier. Mexican War comes, the U.S. suddenly has a lot more Western territory. During the war, of course, we get the Wilmot Proviso, which fails in the Senate, although it passes in the House, saying that you can't allow slavery in any of these new territories. And now we're back to 1820, but it's now 1850. California demanding entrance to the Union with a population that exceeds, I believe, Delaware at least, and maybe a couple of other states, and growing rapidly. And Southerners demanding that all of the new Mexican cession be open to slavery. And that's in fact what happens. And so by the mid-1850s, you have slavery in Utah, the Mormons, who of course had left the United States, fleeing American religious oppression, fleeing the persecution to go to Mexico, only to have the army catch up with them and yank them back into the United States. But the Mormons brought slavery with them to Utah. There is some slavery in New Mexico. The slave code is passed in New Mexico. Slave code is passed in Utah. Utah, of course, also includes Nevada. And the notion is that now the Missouri Compromise has been abrogated for the new territories. It is worth understanding that in the history of the U.S., every territory where slavery had been allowed ended up creating a slave state. Every territory where slavery had been in some ways limited or banned ended up being a free state. So if you allow slavery in Utah, even if you argue it's not going to be a very big deal, you're going to get Utah as a slave state. And of course, if we think about the history of world slavery, as I do a lot, slavery was used for mining in all over Europe. The Roman Empire used slaves as miners. The West is mining country. So that's the Missouri Compromise, undone in part by the Compromise of 1850. Then we get Kansas, Nebraska, where you have an Illinois senator pushing to end the Missouri Compromise in much of what is left of the compromise area through the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That passes. You get in 1856 a presidential contest between somebody who loves the Kansas-Nebraska Act and loves the idea of spreading slavery to the West. James Buchanan, I think if you could Google Doughface, Buchanan's face would pop up. He is the ultimate Northern man with Southern principles. By the way, he came from a slaveholding family in Pennsylvania, and in his early life, he actually sold a black bondsperson who was under a indenture left over from slavery when his father died. So Buchanan has been involved in slavery in lots of ways already. He is a pro-slavery president. He wins the election. He then has his inaugural address. And what does he say? He says, the question of slavery in the territories is before the Supreme Court. It is a judicial question. This is the weirdest thing, perhaps, that any president up to that time had ever said in an inaugural address. The question of slavery in the territories has always been legislative. But now suddenly Buchanan says, no, it's not legislative, it's judicial. Let the Supreme Court decide it. And of course, he knows how the court's going to decide it because at least 2 and probably 3 justices have told him. And stupidly, before he gets up to give his address, he leans over and has a brief whispering with Chief Justice Taney. They talk for a minute. I don't know, maybe they were singing the Dickinson College fight song together. I don't know, because they're both Dickinson graduates. Maybe they're just saying how wonderful it is. We've been Jacksonian Democrats all our lives, and now I'm president and you're Chief Justice. But the point is, he then gets up and he says, I will endorse whatever the court says in Dred Scott. And then shortly thereafter, the court in Dred Scott says Congress has no power to ban slavery in any of the territories. This, of course, will turn the Republican Party from a minority party in 1856 to a party that wins the election in 1860. The Dred Scott decision will make Lincoln president because he is the most articulate critic of Dred Scott. And he goes all over the North speaking about Dred Scott. It sets him up for the presidency. And the weird thing of this is that when Lincoln is running for president, or in 1856 when Fremont is, it is the Northerners, the opponents of slavery, who have now completely embraced the Missouri Compromise. Because if they could get it back, you stop the spread of slavery, and it's put on the road of ultimate extinction. I'm probably out of time. So I cede my time to the moderator.
Sorry, yeah, thank you so much. Sorry, thank you so much. I was just clicking to unmute myself. Thank you very much. Professor Hammond, if you would be next.
Sure, I'm going to actually begin with a small screen share here and a quotation for us. It's actually a quotation from, it's a recent immigrant from England who's living in Ohio. And he's very excited about prohibiting slavery's expansion forever in the United States. Missouri Compromise comes, word of the Missouri Compromise gets to Ohio that Congress has decided to admit Missouri as a state with slavery. He goes ahead and he writes a letter to a prominent politician in Ohio expressing his disappointment. It's a foreboding letter about what's going to transpire in the United States in the future. And Green writes that the great Missouri question is finally determined. And I cannot but think every true American has cause to blush for the reputation of his country. He did not like the Missouri Compromise. The period is probably very far distant when the effects of the monstrous principle of extending the miseries of slavery will be witnessed in a radical modification of our present form of government, or in the still more dreadful evil of a dissolution of our union. But that the seeds of fatal sectional dissension to occur hereafter are sown, I have no doubt. Their expansion and their embryo growth will be gradual but sure, their ultimate maturity certain, and posterity will curse the day in which the proposed restriction on the admission of Missouri was rejected in favor of the Missouri Compromise. I don't want to speak here today so much about the Missouri Compromise itself. I will come back to that. But what I really want to talk about is what precedes the Missouri Compromise. What precedes the Missouri Compromise, the way William Graham phrases it, is the Missouri question. And for contemporaries living in the United States in 1819 and 1820, what we now call the Missouri Crises as historians, contemporaries called the Missouri question, or as Green calls it, the Great Missouri Question. The origins of this, the origins of the Missouri question, are actually pretty routine. In 1818, white settlers who live in Missouri claim that they've met the population requirements sufficient for statehood. They apply for statehood. That goes before Congress in early 1819 at the very end of a session of Congress. By this point, in February of 1819, admitting new states has become pretty routine. Once you have the end of the War of 1812 and 1815, you have several states that become states. In previous sessions where this has come before Congress, it's very pro forma. The vote's made, they move on to statehood. Question of Missouri statehood comes before Congress in February of 1819. It seems like it's going to be the same way, simply a pro forma vote. The only question, if there's any question, is whether or not Missouri meets the minimum qualifications for statehood, which means that it has a population greater than the smallest state, which is Delaware. Things seem to be going routine enough. And then in February of 1819, a gentleman by the name of James Talmadge, who's a congressman from New York, he introduces his amendments to the Missouri bill, to the Missouri statehood bill. And in his amendments, he argues that Missouri should prohibit the further introduction of slaves. So no more slaves can be forced into Missouri by slave owners migrating there from places like Virginia. No slaves can be sold into Missouri once Missouri becomes a state. So the idea there is to prohibit the further introduction of slaves into Missouri. And as Dr. Finkelman said earlier, the hope here is that slavery will eventually be abolished in a place like Missouri. What Talmadge also adds to the Missouri state bill is a proviso that Missouri will have to emancipate slaves who were born in the state of Missouri at the age of 25. So this isn't going to end slavery in Missouri immediately, but what it will do is it'll provide a long-term plan of gradual emancipation for slavery in Missouri. It's going to take multiple generations. If you look at what happened in the northern states, when they began adopting these kinds of laws, typically it took close to 50 years before slavery was finally eradicated from a state like Pennsylvania. In either case, these are the conditions that Congressman Talmadge imposes or seeks to impose on Missouri statehood. It's near the end of the session. Nobody really wants to stick around. Everybody wants to get out of town. So there's some furious debate that lasts for a couple of days. The vote comes before the House. It passes the House. So the Talmadge amendments pass the House. It's promptly rejected by the Senate. And then Congress adjourns. Congress adjourns in March of 1819 with the Missouri question unresolved. Doesn't seem like a big deal. But what happens during the summer and moving into the fall of 1819 is you have a group of dedicated, they're not abolitionists. It doesn't make sense necessarily to call these kinds of people abolitionists, but they're just a group of people who live in the northern states, typically white men who are committed to democracy. And what they see by 1819 is that the greatest threat to democracy is no longer federalist, would-be aristocrat monarchists, whatever they want to call them, living in New England. It's no longer England itself. As far as they are concerned, the greatest threat to democracy in a place like Pennsylvania is the great expansion of slavery in the United States. What this leads to in the North over the course of the summer and then moving into the fall, moving into the early winter of 1819, is you have really an unprecedented political campaign. It's not done by politicians, it's done by newspaper printers and the like, to raise public awareness, to put pressure on Northern congressmen to repass the Missouri bill or to pass the Missouri bill and to make sure that those Talmadge restrictions are part of the bill. This group of people, they end up calling themselves their restrictionists. They're in favor of restrictions on Missouri. But more than just favoring restrictions on slavery in Missouri, what this pretty quickly turns into by the fall of 1819 is the Great Missouri Question. And the Great Missouri Question is the question of whether or not slavery will be permitted to expand in the United States at all. By December of 1819, many Northerners are calling for the prohibition of slavery's expansion, not just in Missouri, but the phrase that's commonly used in the North is, to quote them, in all states or territories hereafter admitted to the Union. What many Northern restrictionists want by the time Congress is meeting again in January of 1820, is they want the United States to go ahead and prohibit slavery's further expansion anywhere. So that once you pass the Missouri bill, there's going to be some other kind of bill that's going to be attached to that will forever prohibit slavery's expansion, not just in Missouri, but in all of the United States. That takes the simple question of Missouri statehood and it turns it into this Great Missouri Question. The expectations of Northern restrictionists, people who are in favor of these kinds of expectations, as Dr. Finkelman said earlier, the expectation here is not that the federal government's going to come in and abolish slavery in the southern states. But the expectation is that in 1818, you prohibited the international slave trade. It's not really enforced all that much, that prohibition on the international slave trade. But by 1818, 1819, 1820, for lots of different reasons, the United States government, the federal government, is cracking down on the international slave trade. So you end the further introduction of slaves into the United States. At the same time, you prohibit slavery's expansion, not just in Missouri, but everywhere in all future states and territories hereafter admitted to the Union. The expectation that Northern whites have at that point then is that somehow or another, Southern whites will be forced to go ahead and to grapple with the issue of slavery, and that somehow or another, they're going to go ahead and they're going to be forced to do what they've said they're going to do for the previous 50 years. So from the 1770s onward, white Southerners are saying slavery is awful. We wish we could do something about it. We can't do anything about it right now. Well, the hope of Northern whites is that it's going to force Southern whites to finally do something about slavery. And as far as Northern whites are concerned, it's an incredibly generous offer because it's forcing Northern whites to grapple with slavery on their own terms. That's the position that Northern restrictionists in Congress bring to this debate in the winter of 1819, really in January, February of 1820. The position of Southern whites, we can call them Southern expansionists if that works for us. The position of Southern whites is entirely different. You take Southern whites and you take the meaning and the significance of slavery to them. Slavery is important to Southern whites in 1770, and it only grows in importance over the next 15 years. You look at slavery and what becomes the United States in, say, 1776, go back to 1770, either way works there. But if you look at slavery in the United States in 1776, it's confined to 5 seaborne colonies. There's about 350,000 enslaved men and women in the southern colonies, another 50,000 in the north. Slavery only grows in importance in the 1780s, in the 1790s, in the 1800s, in the 1810s. By the time you move to 1820, depending on how you count a slave state or not a slave state, there's an 11 or 12 slave states in the United States. The enslaved population in the United States has gone from about 400,000 to about 1.5 million. Slavery, which was mostly a coastal institution in the United States in 1776, has become basically a semi-continental institution by 1820. And even where the great rush, expansion, and growth of slavery is taking place, in places like Alabama and Mississippi, even not in those places, in places like Virginia or Maryland, slavery is still becoming more important. The value of slaves are going up in places like Maryland and places like Virginia and in places like Kentucky because of slavery's great growth and expansion elsewhere. What all of this means is that most Southern whites are not going to consent to any kind of restrictions on slavery, not just in Missouri, but more broadly in all of the United States. The position that most Southern whites end up developing in response to the Missouri question or to the Talmud restrictions is they tend to argue that Congress lacks any authority, any constitutional authority to prohibit slavery in any territory. This is before you even get into the states. And they make a further argument there that Congress is obligated to protect the rights and the interest of slaveholders in all states and in all territories. By February of 1820, you have basically 2 positions where there isn't much room for compromise. And kind of raises the question here of then where does this compromise come from with this Missouri Compromise? Southern whites have no intention on compromising on much of anything. They have no intention of recognizing that Congress has the authority to restrict slavery anywhere, whether it's a state or it's a territory. The only reason that Southern whites end up agreeing to this compromise is because, as far as they're concerned, the Missouri Compromise that's on the table, the 3630 line plus Missouri statehood, as far as they're concerned, that's the least worst deal that they can get out of Congress, prohibiting slavery north of that 3630 line. And the Missouri Compromise, the way it's kind of come down to us in terms of history and in historiography, is that a group of Union-loving Southern statesmen stepped forward and saved the Union with this heroic compromise. This is where Henry Craig Hammond, his nickname, the Great Compromiser, comes from. But the only real reason they end up agreeing to this compromise is because, as far as they're concerned, if they don't solve the issue right here, right now, in February or March of 1820, Northern whites are going to use it to run the election of 1820 on, which means they're going to win control of Congress in the Missouri crisis. It means they're going to win control of the presidency on the basis of the Missouri crisis. And if the question or the issue is left open for another year, the fear is you're going to end up with something that's going to be much, much worse. The fear is you're going to have a Congress who's going to prohibit slavery, not just in Missouri, But the fear is you're going to have a Congress that's going to prohibit slavery everywhere they possibly can. So with that, Southern whites quickly go ahead, at least a sufficient number do, agree to this compromise. And this compromise pledges in March of 1820. We have about a minute left here. All I want to say is that this Missouri Compromise, it manages to put off the question of slavery in an expanding federal union for the better part of about 15, 20 years, maybe 30 years if you want to be generous about this. But I don't think the Missouri Compromise could have solved, which is the real issue that faces the United States from the beginning, whether it's 1776, 1787, 1790, whatever year you want to take. And the issue there is that the United States isn't a nation in 1776 or 1790 or in 1820. The United States is a federal union. It's also a federal union that's intent on creating a continental empire, continental union, whatever term you want to use there. As long as slavery exists in the United States, the issue of slavery's expansion is going to keep coming up. It comes up in 1787, 1790. It's resolved by the Northwest and the Southwest Ordinance. It comes up in 1820, and it almost destroys the United States. And then the Compromise of 1820 puts it off, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 puts it off for another generation, generation and a half, or whatever might work. But as Professor Finkelman said, ultimately, this is what leads to the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. This is ultimately what leads to civil war, the inability of the United States to address this issue of slavery's expansion in a continental union. Right? Thank you.
And thank you so much. I'll go straight to Professor Pasley, if you please.
All right. Well, welcome. Glad to do this. Seems to be a summer for learning. Thanks to all the COVID-born Zoom capability we all have. So we had a number of talked about a number. This was the charge for this session was quite open-ended, so I guess I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about the Missouri end of things, though in a kind of broader way, because one of the things I like to talk about when I talk to people here is the degree to which is the sort of outsized, partly because of the arrangement that's made at the time of the Missouri Compromise about what a problem, long-term problem was created in the state of Missouri, which I sometimes refer to as, what a problem was created, what a problem the state of Missouri became for the Union. In fact, I sometimes talk about it as the state the Union couldn't swallow, because the Missouri Compromise seems to create more problems. It smooths out the situation for a while, but in the long term, it seems to create more problems than it's solved by doing this thing that I can really kind of show best with a map. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to apologize if some of these things are slightly out of order. So here we go. We'll get back to this. We'll get back to this in a second. Just getting myself get myself back in the right place. So creates more problems by creating the situation. You see, this is the situation as of the mid 1850s, where you've got. Or on the eve of the Civil War, where you've got essentially what I sometimes call the state as a sword thumb of slavery sticking out into what had become, at least in the North what they were considered it as a zone of freedom. And what you see is that Missouri, being left where it was, becomes this kind of recurring flashpoint, largely because of the geographic oddity that the Missouri crisis left behind. And following through it, and this is actually just, I sometimes have to teach a Missouri history course where I actually kind of structure a lot of a certain part of it about basically in terms of all the problems that Missouri caused for the Union, starting with this original one. And to make a long story very short, basically what happens is something happens in Missouri in every major era to either worsen the situation or to sort of inflame the politics of the rest of the country, radicalizing one group or the other about the sectional crisis was developing and about the tactics they might have to take. And it started with the original Missouri crisis that we've been talking about, where as Craig said, as both Craig and Paul talked about, I think especially Craig, where even though the northern people who saw the West, especially the Northwest, as some kind of place where there wasn't to be slavery, or a place where slavery was somehow going to be banned by the Northwest Ordinance, even though it wasn't. They still were going on expectations that the West was going to be white, and this was based on. Craig talked about the fact that slavery was resurging in the North, was resurging in the South, but of course the other side of that was that slavery was in decline in the North, and what the voters for the Talmadge Amendment, the people who voted for the Talmadge Amendment actually were originally thinking was that you see that by constitutions or by gradual emancipation laws, that all of the New England states, and then finally Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York, all passed laws that at least begin the phase out of slavery, even though there's still enslaved people in New Jersey way later than this. The Northwest Ordinance, of course, people in the Northeast somewhat wrongly thought of that as having completely wiped out slavery, even though in fact slavery had been kind of hidden in different ways in the Northwest. But at any rate, they looked at the West and they decided to draw this line into Mississippi because they looked at the West and thought of that as a place that was going to be free of slavery, that was probably going to be, and was a white supremacist angle, because they also look forward to a West that was going to be only be dominated completely by white people. So this is the kind of expectation that this would continue, that leads to the Northern Congressmen voting for the Talmadge Amendment. And of course, we've already heard some very good perspectives on what this ultimately meant, and it's kind of debatable, and even historians kind of debate about what the Missouri Compromise actually meant. Was it blocking off half the country from slavery in a way that was important, or was it this terrible capitulation to slavery? For a lot of Northerners, especially for a lot of politically active black people, it was a terrible capitulation. And so the group that's radicalized by this is often the first black abolitionists, people like David Walker and the others behind the first black newspaper, Freedom's Journal. This was one of the particular issues that radicalized them and made them look at other tactics. The fact that clearly after the Missouri Compromise, that slavery was going to continue in a way that at least some people had hoped that it wouldn't. In the founding era and up through the War of 1812. Of course, and this leaves then Missouri in this very strange strange situation. And I'm going to go ahead to something else. You can see this there's a sort of somewhat hard to see map of the Missouri Compromise line. But what I was really going for was the moral map. This was an abolitionist production that you would see versions of actually throughout the antebellum period. This one's as from 1837, and you can kind of get the attitude when you see the little epigraph from Lafayette at the bottom, if you can read that. It is a dark slave, meaning slavery. It's a dark spot on the face of the nation. Such a state of things cannot always exist. That is to say that this contradiction. And you can see then from the moral map that Missouri, this is the one where Missouri really is sticking out like a sore thumb, in the sense that you have Illinois, what's going to become the free states of Illinois and Indiana on two sides, and then foreign territory on the other, the northern part of Indian Territory by this time, but at least according to some, at least according to them, or the next stop in a lot of ways was Spanish and then Mexican territory. And part of the problem here, part of the problem that Missouri causes in this situation is that Illinois and Missouri, in some ways, both faced the same issue of there were people of white Southerners moving slaves west, enslaved people west into these areas. Illinois managed to kind of finesse the situation. Illinois, which had a connection to the Great Lakes and to the Northeast, Illinois came up with a kind of a sort of hidden slavery, French slavery they called it, where former enslaved people only were basically signed to lifetime contracts. Finesse not being part of the Missouri personality, Missouri instead fought tooth and nail to openly defend their quote-unquote rights to enslaved property, and that's what they would kind of do then throughout the further rounds of this controversy. The Missourians are always ready to fight, and they're to fight for their right originally to take enslaved slaves to the frontier, and then eventually to take them to other parts of the frontier. So then other flashpoints, and I actually didn't really see what time I've started. Do you guys have a timer running? I just have a couple more points anyway.
It's 2:42. I think a few more minutes is
A few more minutes. So
acceptable.
what time did I start? See, I always forget to look at what time I start.
I'd say at most another another 5 minutes, shall we say?
Oh, sure. 5 minutes. Okay. Perfect. No, that works. That works perfectly. So I really just want to mention a couple other things, because this is some ways just it's a bit of a catalog of all the things that Missouri managed to get into. So thanks to those nearby borders, and then of course the river transportation system that develops, kind of centering in the steamboat era transportation system that kind of centers around St. Louis. Missouri, and especially St. Louis, become a kind of racial crossroads where white and black travelers and workers cross paths all the time. Missouri infamously passes there's a second part of the Missouri debates that has to do with Missouri trying to, in the original Missouri Constitution, there's a requirement that the legislature pass laws barring free blacks from moving into the state. Now that's the kind of law that actually becomes very common throughout the nation in the antebellum years. Missouri, though, tried to do it ahead of time. Missouri tried to do it first, and was forced to kind of pinky swear that it would not pass a law like that. But at any rate, it's supposed to be a place where there's no free blacks. But in fact, because of the way that the steamboat industry worked, there were all kinds of enslaved and free black people and people who just nobody knew what their status was, moving back and forth in this area. And a number of controversies and conflicts come out of this. It causes flare-ups of racial violence, like the lynching of a free black boatman named Francis McIntosh, who was tied up to a tree and burned alive in 1836. That in turn then leads to a more famous incident, the murder of anti-slavery editor Elijah P. Lovejoy in Illinois, but he started out in St. Louis, and he got in trouble in St. Louis initially for criticizing the barbarity of the burning of Francis McIntosh. He goes to Illinois, and I guess it's unclear whether. Got a couple other things that are kind of in the wrong order here, but let me get to my Lovejoy. There's Lovejoy. There's Elijah P. Lovejoy in his Alton, Illinois printing office where he'd moved from St. Louis, being burned down. That incident, that radicalizes a lot. Another way that people get radicalized by the killing of Elijah P. Lovejoy, a very important one of which was Abraham Lincoln.
Hi, Jeff.
Yes.
Can you share your screen? The green little button there.
Am I not sharing the screen this whole time?
No.
Am I not sharing the screen this whole time?
No.
Oh, but you should have said.
Yeah. I'm just now seeing that, so my apologies, Jeff.
Okay, so all right, so I was going on about the moral map, and no one saw.
Yeah, there should be a green button down at the bottom.
Yep. Okay.
All right. Cool.
All right. So it looked to me like I was. All right. Well, there's Elijah P. Lovejoy. Should I go back to the moral map that I would spent the whole time talking about?
Yes,
Maybe I
please.
should. Okay, sorry about that, you all. All right, this is the thing I was talking about the sticking out, this short thumb of slavery sticking out into the zone of freedom. At least as the people in the North saw it. So the borders and rivers became a problem, and of course the other problem that was long-term issue that was generated by that, I mean, the killing of Lovejoy is just, and killings of Francis McIntosh and Eliza Lovejoy is just one particular moment. But of course, the long-term one is the issue of the freedom suits that would come out of this situation, where especially freedom suits were done everywhere, but in the particular type of freedom suit that would often be successful in Missouri had to do with the idea that if someone had been held in a place where slavery was illegal, which were all very nearby, that they'd be free. Once free, always free. And of course, famously, a certain slave named Dred Scott had a suit filed on that basis, and won his suit, but by the time that wended its way up to the Supreme Court, in the 1850s, they were trying to cut back that Missouri loophole, along with all the other loopholes in the law of slavery, thus causing the radicalization that Paul Finkelman talked about earlier. The other issue, I guess, the one that I'll sort of leave you on, is the fact that Missouri in the area that it's near, becomes an area where the traditional migration streams cross and eventually begin to compete and conflict. So you see that this is what I sometimes call this one of my favorite maps teaching. I'm so glad I'm actually showing these now. Right, this is up now, right? But it's called a layer Keg Migration Map, where you see that going back to colonial times, the pattern had always been, and there's good reasons for this, climate and such, people tended to move, when Americans moved west, they tended to move straight west. It's to stay more or less in the same climatic band they were in. When you get to, because of the French territory and the pattern of the rivers and different reasons, this area around the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi becomes an area where both Northerners and Southerners end up in this kind of in the same zone. And this is a thing that, even though obviously the slave state forces went out in Missouri and the the Illinois kind of backs off from an attempt to kind of subvert completely subvert the Northwest Ordinance. You get a situation here. You get a situation in this area where you've got an area that's dominated by slavery, but in the St. Louis area, increasingly, slavery is actually getting less and less important. So that by 1860, the Missouri's like 10% enslaved. The St. Louis area is only 1% enslaved. There's a heavy immigration of Germans to this area. There's also lots of investment from New England coming in, to the point where the first railroad that's built across Missouri is built across the Hannibal and St. Joe is built across the north part of it by New England money, connects it to Chicago, and starts to bring other sorts of people into this area. Now, of course, the biggest example of this kind of crossing the migration streams occurs in the 1850s, when following this pattern, and you can even see it in the state of Missouri itself, where you can see the pattern of. You can see that in many ways slavery had been kind of moving west within the state, and then in the 1850s, as the plans go forward to open the railroads to the west of Missouri, and what was then northern Indian Territory was going to be open to white settlement under Stephen Douglas's genius idea of popular sovereignty. A competition opens up where the migration streams cross even more deliberately, where land companies are organized that they're looking to bring Northerners into, or at least people who don't practice slavery. In some cases, actual New Englanders, to bring them into land in what's now Kansas that was very much, according to the usual patterns, something that the Missourians thought was supposed to be theirs. Missourians then are encouraged to ride over and to try to occupy these areas themselves, or at least vote in the elections. And that becomes the famous conflict then that becomes known as Bleeding Kansas, where you've got there we go, where you've got Missourians going over to vote in the elections to try to make sure that Kansas is a slave state, and they appear to succeed in that, at least in terms of winning the elections. But that becomes then, as more and more New England settlers come in, it becomes eventually an armed conflict known as Bleeding Kansas, a minor guerrilla war with famous incidents like the sack of Lawrence, Kansas, the Anti-Slavery Center, and John Brown's retaliatory killings at Osawatomie Creek. And this then revolutionized that, plus the Kansas-Nebraska Act that opened up this situation, plus the reaction to Bleeding Kansas, kind of revolutionizes national politics. That and the Dred Scott decision, another Missouri thing, kind of produced the Republican Party, and in that sense, you find Missouri involved, and especially in this unique situation of jutting up into free territory, where Missouri's unique geographic situation becomes something that the Union can't handle over and over again. In the 1850s is the last time, and then of course, just to follow that up, Missouri then experiences the worst guerrilla warfare in American history in some ways during the Civil War itself, when they go attack Kansas again and actually kill quite a few more people in 1863. So that's probably enough time for me. But the Missouri, but it all goes back to the fact that what seemed to be a sort of elegant compromise made in 1820 was a continually ramifying problem throughout the rest of the antebellum period. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much. Okay, so Well, so I'm going to just remind everybody who is watching and listening that you can please put in more questions into the chat or the question and answer Q&A buttons below. I will just suggest, by the way, the possibility that anybody who is providing materials like Professor Pasley, maybe you can send them to our technical team and we could see possibly about putting that up as a PDF onto a web page or something, some way available for people to look at afterwards.
Sure.
So I think this is technically doable, but I'm putting this out as a possibility. I'm going to start with a question of my own. Following up on a comment by one of you, in fact, we often think about slavery as disuniting the Union, but is there a way, should we instead be thinking of the crisis, the Missouri Compromise and others, as unifying rather, but instead of unifying a bunch of people in local state cultures, in effect creating two rival nations, Northern and Southern, unified precisely about the question of slavery and caring more and more about the federal government, precisely because that's the relevant piece of constitutional machinery by which you're going to address slavery?
I don't think so. I would argue, and Craig and Jeff may take me on, but it seems to me that that slavery has been disuniting the Union since 1775, when there was a debate in the Continental Congress about whether or not you should make the states pay into the national treasury for fighting the war with Britain on the basis of population. And Thomas Lynch of South Carolina says that if you are going to consider slaves to be people rather than property, then there is an end to this country right now. And he said there's no more reason to tax the slaves of South Carolina than the sheep of New Hampshire. To which Ben Franklin, who is not usually put off by blustering fools from South Carolina, says, well, there's a big difference between sheep and slaves. Sheep will never make a revolution. And so the reason we should be taxing you for your slaves is because they are in fact a threat to national security. And Southerners insist that slaves are not people from 1775 up to 1787. And then you get the Constitutional Convention, where suddenly we're talking about population-based representation. And suddenly the Southerners say, oh, no, they're people. And we should count all of them so we can have more representatives in Congress. The 3/5 clause is misunderstood by most Americans as being somehow a statement that is hostile to Black people. Quite the contrary. What it is a compromise over political power, where the slave owners wanted to count slaves fully for representation, and Northerners did not want to count them at all. So this is already in place in the 1770s and 1780s. What we managed to do is to defer the debate until 1819. Although, when one reason we defer the debate is because in the 1790s, the Southern members of Congress are aggressively moving to support slavery every time they can. They love the national government as long as it protects slavery. So they get their fugitive slave law in 1793. They get a prohibition on Blacks becoming naturalized citizens. They get a ban on Blacks serving in the militia. And they get other laws always protecting slavery. And Northerners aren't really thinking about this as a national issue. And so Northerners are kind of less focused on this. I once looked at the National Archives has in it records of Congress. And for the 1793 Congress, it has all of the hand ballots for the fugitive slave law and the various ballots that take place. And so I actually counted them all. The Southerners voted as a block, whether they were Jeffersonians or Federalists, they're all voting to create the 1793 Fugitive Slave Law, and they see it as a solid South bloc. And that works right up to 1819, when Congressman Talmadge says, wait a minute, enough of spreading slavery to the West. And it just continues to descend from there. That would be my take on it. It's not uniting, it's always disuniting. And it's disuniting because, as either Jeff or Craig or both, persuasively said, the Southerners are never going to compromise. They're never going to give up. Slavery is the central issue of their lives. It is the central social and economic institution. It is more the total number of slaves are more valuable than any other kind of privately held property in the United States except real estate. That is, all the slaves are worth more than all of the banks or all of the railroads combined or all of the factories making steel and iron combined. It is the central purpose, and it is always about racial oppression. As Alexander Stevens says in 1861, the Confederacy is built on the notion that Black people are inferior to whites and that they should always be slaves. This is the essence of the South.
Yeah, I don't disagree with Paul in any way. In fact, as soon as that question was asked, I was going to use that example that you used about Benjamin Franklin, about sheep don't cause insurrections. What does slavery do in the United States? Slavery unifies Southern whites, and then it constantly, from day one, threatens to drive apart, not even a nation, but a federal union. It constantly threatens to drive that apart, and there are certain crises that come about. And 1860, if you look at the election of 1860, as much as anything, as Lincoln said, it's a question of the United States is going to eventually become all of one thing or all of the other. But we've been trying this now for over 70 years, and it's not working. But for Southern whites, they'd rather destroy the United States than allow the federal government to exercise any kind of meaningful authority over slavery, or to allow the federal government to exercise to place any kind of meaningful restraints or restrictions on slavery. What destroys the United States? It's slavery.
Let me add one footnote to what Craig just said. It unifies Southern whites to the point where the South becomes a dictatorship. There is no free speech in the South. There is no free press in the South. The South becomes like apartheid South Africa. If you had talked to a South African in the 1960s, they would have said, well, we have a democracy. We all vote. We all can discuss everything. And that's true as long as you all agree not to discuss the elephant in the room, which is apartheid. The same thing is true in the South. You can have two political parties. You can have a democratic election as long as you don't discuss it, anything to do with anti-slavery. And if you do, you might get killed. You might get chased out of the South. There's a man named Hinton Rowan Helper who is a native North Carolinian. He writes a book called The Impending Crisis, saying that slavery is going to destroy the South. He's a social critic. He's not pro-Black. He wants to send all the Blacks out of the U.S., but he says slavery is a threat to our society in the long run. He is literally forced out of the state, fleeing for his life, and his brother writes Wendell Phillips, the abolitionist, and said, will you help me get money? I have to get out of here too, because I'm Helper's brother, and they're going to kill me as well. The South creates this closed society.
And well, so I don't disagree with any of that. I mean, I guess the other answer to that question, though, is it's very divisive in the North too, right? It doesn't unify the North until the very end, right? I mean, that you could say that like at some point during the Civil War, maybe that the North was unified, but the slavery issue, I mean, Paul used the term doughface, which is an insult that was come up. They had to have a term to talk about Northerners who were in alliance with the South, and of course, that was the problem that the Democratic Party had throughout not just throughout the antebellum years, but then through a lot of the postbellum years and into the early 20th century as well. The fact that They involved an alliance between Southerners and certain elements in the North. And in the antebellum period, I mean, especially when the abolitionist movement becomes big, there's this whole phenomenon of where Northern Democrats have got to show their loyalty to the South, where they become part of the, they have to be involved in the apartheid state too, by showing that their mobs can destroy, they help ban abolitionist stuff from the mail. Northern Democrats are often involved in sort of sticking mobs on abolitionist meetings, and it's more to do with they often didn't necessarily love slavery themselves. It had to do with their desire to try to keep in alliance with the South. So, and there were there draft riots in New York and during the Civil War over whether or not some people are going to go fight. Northerners are going to be drafted to go fight in the South to fight against slavery. So I would say that the slavery issue is unifies the South. It terribly divides the North. So it's hard to see it as a unifying force in the sense I think you meant.
Let me just add one last point there to everything that's been said, is that you look at people like Washington, you look at people like Jefferson and Madison, Monroe, they're I don't know if it was their fear, but they firmly expected that slavery and sectionalism was going to destroy the United States. And slavery and sectionalism was going to destroy that, by 1815, if you get past Washington, 1825, 1830, the nation they had devoted their lives to creating, they knew that slavery and sectionalism was going to destroy it, unless somehow or another Providence intervened. And I don't think that's a fundamental flaw with the United States. It's a question of how do you create a nation or a federal union? Like, we think of the United States as a nation, and it's not. I live in Pennsylvania. I'm driving out to the Grand Canyon in a couple of weeks, and if I was in Europe, it would be the equivalent of driving from London to Russia. Think about what you see between London and Russia, or London and Istanbul. The United States is not a nation. It's nowhere close to being a nation, and it's always on the verge of falling apart. But the one thing that those differences keep coming back to is slavery and sectional differences. Let me just say one last thing to that. I'm not surprised that the United States fell apart. I'm surprised that the United States lasted as long as it did. When you come at it from the perspective of 1775, 1787, 1790.
Thank you. I am going to switch to a question from the audience. Carol Crumlish. Would someone please talk about slavery's role in the growth of the amazing development of the textile industry in the United States, please?
I'll take a quick shot. The textile industry takes off around 1820, more or less, in the US, and it started earlier in England, but we didn't have the equipment, and it was actually a British textile worker effectively memorized all the plans for building a textile making machinery and kept them in his head, came to America, and that launches the industry. The industry is, of course, huge. Textiles become very valuable in the growth of parts of New England and in upstate New York. Their textile mills are run by water power, and cotton is much cheaper than wool. By the way, had there been no cotton, those sheep in New Hampshire produced a lot of wool. You would still have woolen cloth. One of the I think mistakes people make in understanding this period is the assumption that Northerners are embedded with slavery because they are dependent on Southern cotton. I don't think that's true because, of course, England was also theoretically dependent on Southern cotton until it didn't get any more, and then it immediately bought cotton from Egypt and India and other places. Southerners believed that Southern cotton ran the world. Cotton is king. But they believed their own propaganda. They believed, in a sense, their own lies. When the Civil War begins, the Confederacy, in perhaps the stupidest of its many, many, many stupid things that the Confederate government does. It's just one list of stupidities after another. But the stupidest one may have been to put an embargo on selling cotton to Great Britain before the war actually begins, so that the cotton is sitting on all the docks and can't go anywhere. What they should have done was shipped every ball of cotton they could find to England as quickly as possible and get a bunch of cash in British banks to buy the guns and ships they were going to need. They didn't do that. And of course, as soon as the war starts, there's something which the Southerners have completely forgotten about called the US Navy, which basically stops most of the shipping to England. But England doesn't need Southern cotton. And Southerners didn't realize this because they forgot that there were places like Egypt and India where they never read any history. I don't know which it was.
They didn't have any maps, probably.
Yeah,
World maps.
Or nobody was sharing their screen with them on the maps.
Well, yeah. I'm very sorry. You guys took like 5 minutes to say anything.
I was wondering whether I should text you actually.
Well, I got my phone turned off. So. Anyway.
But what I'll add quickly to that too is that kind of like everything else we've said here, northern dependence, not dependence, but the use of northern people who have interest in southern cotton and southern plantations ends up dividing the North. You know, the one famous dichotomy in the Whig Party is you have conscious Whigs versus cotton Whigs. Cotton Whigs who have whatever kinds of ties to the South. So it plays a role, but it plays a role that just ends up dividing the North once again.
I'm going to go with another question from Larry Sides in this case. In high school, I was taught that Clay, Calhoun, and Webster were the giants of the Senate. What were their influence on the Missouri Compromise?
Well, I keep talking first, but I'm happy to let somebody else talk first. Clay negotiates the compromise. He's the great compromiser. He's a slave owner from Kentucky. He's a gambler. He's a horse. He bets on horses. He's a party guy. He gets along with everybody. He knows how to drink in the Senate. He knows where all the good places are to hang out. He makes lots of friends, and he gets it through. By the way, he completely fails in getting the Compromise of 1850 through, although most of the high school textbooks that I grew up with said he wrote the Compromise of 1850. It's a complete failure there. And that's actually put together mostly by Stephen Douglas. But yeah, and Calhoun, I'm trying to remember, I think Calhoun actually opposes the compromise because he, at this point, is no longer interested in seeing a stop to the spread of slavery. But
well,
I'll defer to.
He's in the cabinet
Craig.
during this one, right?
Yeah, so Clay's obviously the speaker. They're having like secret meetings. So Monroe's president, and then kind of like the Southern leadership.
He's the speaker. Thank you.
They're having secret meetings, and like there's this one great diary entry that John Quincy Adams has. He's Secretary of State. They're excluding him from these meetings, and where like Clay comes up to him, and it's pretty clear like on this day, Southern leadership, Calhoun in the War Department, but also representing South Carolina and various Southern kind of factions in politics, they agree that they have to support a compromise because they're just going to get something much worse if they don't solve it right now. And Clay runs into John Quincy Adams after church services, and he's like he can't, like he's like a kid bubbling up, like can't wait to tell him that he knows a secret that nobody else knows. Henry Clay. So John Quincy Adams records in his diary that day this bizarre, like I ran into a really bizarre Henry Clay today with some really bizarre stuff. But those two, Clay and Calhoun, Webster doesn't really have much of it, but Clay and Calhoun are part of a group of, it varies by each meeting, but say 5 to 10 people who meet and agree that Clay is firmly opposed to any kind of compromise. Calhoun is firmly opposed. But again, they come to, as is Monroe, they come to, I don't know if I want to say a recognition, but they believe that if they don't stop this now, things are only going to get much, much worse.
Query, how much does the process of going through this, Missouri Compromise itself radicalize, the disunion within the union? How much is it simply, making people aware of how disunited people have become already, by 1818, and how much does simply the process of quarreling it in and of itself make people more radical and disunited?
Well, if I can, I'll just say a little thing. I think I think it's sort of long term. I guess when like some of the radicalization is people looking back at it and talking about how that was when they realized, and it's hard to say. I mean, because things quiet down quite a bit after right after this. I would say that there were, even though it's quite from if we have the historians' view of things and know what the economic trends were and what was going on in all kinds of different places, that it really did that we know that the Cotton Kingdom was coming on, and we kind of know what was happening. There was a lot of I think there were a lot of naive people, a lot of naive. One of the things that we that was kind of recently on people's minds was that there had been a recent, the 50th anniversary was coming up, and there was this republication everyone bought, republication of the Declaration of Independence that everyone had bought, that was very popular at the time. So there was a lot of sort of fairly naive optimism leading up to this about how slavery was on the way out, and this was that since the slave trade had been abolished, that it was just a matter of cleaning some of this up, and then slavery be heading out. And so they're shocked by things like, not just by the fact that that slavery is spreading into the West, but one of the other things that we talk about, and I forgot to hold up the Craig and I's book, by the way. There he is. Just got it in the mail. Here we go. Firebell in the Past, Volume 1, Volume 2 coming. One of the things behind the Talmadge Amendment is that the slave trade has been, the international slave trade has supposedly been closed since 1808, but there's this kind of very rapidly developing internal slave trade that's developing in a fairly big trade in kidnapping people. Or taking people who are about to be gradually emancipated and spiriting them out of Delaware and Maryland and New Jersey and Northern Virginia and Pennsylvania, spiriting them, or off the streets of Philadelphia, spiriting them down south where they to be re-enslaved, to be kept in slavery or re-enslaved or put in slavery for the first time. So there's kind of scandals about that kind of thing. So there's a certain amount of scales falling from naive people's eyes, I think, that go on during this period, during the late 1810s. Obviously, there's going to be a whole bunch of other, it seems like there's some group of people who get the scales fall from their eyes several other times, but that's the way these kind of things go. It takes people sometimes takes more than once to have people finally learn to change their minds.
I think that what Jeff says is in part a function of the fact that the South by 1820 is already pretty much a closed society. So Southerners are actually quite shocked that Northerners are all upset about slavery. It's like, why, how couldn't they love slavery? We love slavery. It's wonderful for us. And again, many Southerners have had very few contacts with the North. You take a guy like Roger Taney, who becomes Chief Justice, with the exception of about 2.5 years at Dickinson College, he never lives north of the Mason-Dixon line. He spends his entire life in Maryland and DC. He is a very, very, narrow person in that way. John Marshall is a great exception to this because John Marshall fought with Washington. He was at Valley Forge. He's in Europe. He's kind of a sophisticated guy. And what's curious about Marshall is that while he is buying and selling slaves his whole life, he is a massive slave owner, which I was stunned to discover when I wrote Supreme Injustice. Marshall is very quiet about it. Because he knows Northerners don't like slavery. So he doesn't tell his friend Joseph's story. By the way, I just bought some more slaves today. I like buying slaves. He just is very quiet about owning. But other Southerners are very brazen. They bring their slave mistresses to Washington, D.C. They buy and sell slaves in Washington, D.C. And they just don't get, why would anybody object to this? At least that's my take on reading them. And it's in part because when they go home, they only talk. I mean, the conflict that Jeff just talked about, Northerners, some are cotton Whigs, some are conscious Whigs. Same thing with Craig's points. That's not happening in the South. There's no debate.
Well, there's some, Paul. One of the things I guess one of the things I see in this is not really a debate. I mean, there's still like what my former colleague Krista Dirkside talks about as the amelioration movement. Is something where they still think they're some Southern there's colonizationists and there are people who think that. I mean, one of the weird things about the Missouri side of these debates is that one of the things they keep constantly emphasizing is slavery out here is not like it is in some place back down south. In fact, that if you don't let us have slavery, you're going to be hurting these slaves, because otherwise they're going to get sent to Mississippi or Georgia or something like that. That'll really be bad. Whereas here, it's the climate's better, and they'll kind of go on, and it's a kind of weird sort of pro-slavery argument. Particular to doing it in a more northerly climate.
Although most of the Southern colonizationists aren't worried about slaves, they're worried about free blacks.
Right.
Chief Justice John Marshall goes to the Virginia legislature after Nat Turner's rebellion and asks for money to remove every free black from Virginia. He says that half of the free blacks in Richmond are criminals. And he puts this in, it's in writing, it's again in Supreme Injustice. They hate free blacks because free blacks are living proof that all their lies about racial inferiority are wrong. So the best thing to do is get rid of free blacks, and then they've proved that black people can only survive as slaves.
So Paul, I'm gonna send for this here. So you got a lot of John Marshall dirt in your.
Yeah.
That somehow gets left out of almost everything I've ever read about John Marshall.
Well, it's so there's two things you can do. One is you should all buy my books, Supreme Injustice, Harvard Press. But the other thing is I did a very short piece on Marshall in the Atlantic. So if you go to Atlantic.com and Google my name, you'll get to the piece. It's a very short one, but it kind of gives the general outline.
Cool. All right, I will. Thank you.
I'm going to go to a question which is basic to the question to the discussion here from Ernest Took. Why did many active Southerners see a need to expand slavery into other regions? How would they have been threatened if slavery had been limited to areas where it already existed?
Well, there was oversupply in the north. There was oversupply in like the older, like Maryland and Virginia. I think they had more larger workforce than they could than they were able to economically use. So that's part of it.
They're worried about the Senate. They're worried about the Electoral College, because even with the 3/5 clause providing making Southern votes in the presidential elections more powerful than Northern votes. At the convention, Madison says the appropriate thing would be to have a direct election of the president, but he says we can't do that because we would have no power on the account of our Negroes. So the Electoral College, by taking the 3/5 clause and folding it into the Electoral College, you give the South more power in electing president. So they're worried about this. They're worried about the Senate. They also, as Jeff just said, they got a lot of slaves in Virginia and Maryland and Kentucky. Kentucky is a major exporter of slaves to further south. And they keep using up their cotton lands. So they need more land to have more slaves. After the Mexican War, there are Southerners in the Senate who were arguing that we should start another war with Mexico and take 3 or 4 more Mexican states. We need more land for slavery.
I mean, I suppose that one thing, the tobacco economy was in decline too. I think the tobacco prices have been, that was the main crop in the old upper South, and that was kind of in decline. So,
and on an even more elemental level, every son of every Virginia planter, for example, believes that he should have his own plantation one day. And when you have 5 sons, you need 5 plantations. And if you look at the migration of Virginia slaveholders, they go from Virginia to the South Carolina, Georgia upcountry. Kind of the first great cotton boom actually doesn't take place in Alabama and Mississippi. It takes place in Piedmont upcountry, South Carolina, and Georgia. And then when that becomes overcrowded by 1815, and actually many of them serve with Andrew Jackson, and they come upon these creek lands in Alabama and Mississippi, and all those who failed in Georgia and South Carolina decides it's time for them to take their hand at establishing a plantation in Mississippi and Alabama.
Thank you.
There's a lot of sons of planters who don't believe that anybody should be governing them, so they just keep moving where nobody can govern them.
Well, I mean, it's kind of all Americans. I think I did get the map that showed the migration patterns. I mean, so they'd all been migrating all the time. So in the South, they thought they had to do it.
A question that always comes up when we teach this is, why did so many non-slaveholding Southern whites fight for the Confederacy when the Confederacy is self-consciously about slavery? And one answer is because they got drafted. The Confederates start the draft long before the United States does, so they get drafted. But the other reason, when my students ask these questions, I always ask my students, how many of you believe in the ownership of your own home? And they all raise their hand. And especially if I'm teaching undergraduates or when I taught in law schools, how many of you own your own home? And like 2 hands go up. And I say, so why do you believe in home ownership if you don't own a home yourself? And they always answer, well, I expect to own one eventually. And I say, welcome to the non-slaveholding class of Southern whites. They all expect to own slaves eventually. And so they have to have more land. If they're not going to inherit land from daddy, they have to move west and get free land, cheap land, and get cheaper and cheaper slaves, which is why they're petitioning to reopen the slave trade in the 1850s.
The price of slaves are so high by the late 1850s, yeah.
And Southerners are trying to annex Cuba.
And 400,000 enslaved men and women.
Yeah, there's a debate on the floor of the Senate in which Ben Wade, who is this, I think he's like 6'5" or 6'6". He's this big guy who moved out to Ohio when it was trees and bears, and he's a tough frontiersman, and he's not afraid of anybody. He's known as Bluff Ben Wade. At one point, some Southerner challenges him to a duel, and he accepts, which no other Northerner ever does. He says, "I get to choose weapons, right?" And the guy shockingly that he said yes. He says, "Yes, you do." He says, "Well, how about squirrel rifles at 10 paces?" And of course, that ends that duel quickly. But Ben Wade in one of these debates says, "You don't want Cuba because you want land for the landless. You want Cuba because you want," and then he uses a word which I won't use in public, but you want Negroes for the Negroists. And he uses the insulting N-word precisely to insult the Southerners. He says, you want Cuba because you want 400,000 slaves to bring into the United States. And there are all kinds of attempts to invade Cuba, attack Cuba, buy Cuba, force Spain to give us Cuba. And it's all Southerners who want it.
Thank you. I'm going to say that it's now about 3:29. I'm going to ask each of you if you'd be so kind as to just provide a quick bit of closing comments, and then I'll just say what's going on next to the series after that to close off. President Finkelman, if I could get you first.
My closing comment has been, this has been enormously fun. It's great to be on a program with Craig and Jeff, especially in this age of COVID when we can't have a drink at a convention, but hopefully we'll be able to do that soon enough. And that I think it is wonderful that you are sponsoring this kind of very serious discussion about what is at the root of our country to this day. That is slavery, the Missouri Compromise, racism, white supremacy. These are at the heart of American history. They have been debated, they have been fought over, and we need to come to terms with them. And we can only do that with these kinds of discussions. So I thank you for doing this. We have to discuss it. So thank you.
Go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody again for having this, as President Finkelman said. And what I would add to this is that, if you look at in the United States in the year 2021, right here, right now, there's a lot of arguing about slavery. But as Paul said, that's been happening in the United States since at least when there's our first notion of creating something called the United Colonies that become the United States. We've been arguing about that, and it's not going away anytime soon. And the only way we can address it is by doing stuff like this, accepting the reality of American history.
Professor Pasley?
Well, yeah, I would second what Craig and Paul said, and I guess this is just a version of what they said. I mean, it's one of the things that's sort of disturbing going on right now in public discourse is the idea that somehow we discuss these things too much, which it can't be. And I'm was glad to have the NAS doing this, and I also think that we like, if you're going to talk about American history, you have to talk about these things. And if you decide that it's all that talking about white supremacy and race and slavery as a fundamental thing in history is part of some theory you don't like, it ain't theory. It's just what was. So thank you for doing this. I also wanted to say that apologize for those images, and I totally do can throw them in a PDF or in a PowerPoint to share with your viewers in case they wanted to know what the hell I was talking about.
Thank you. Well, so in that case, I will just say, look, thank you all again so much. I will just say again to everybody, send me, if you have leftover questions, send them to me. I'll pass them on at randall@nas.org. And that this will be available videotaped within 24 hours. We have white glove service on this. This series will be continuing. Our next one will be 1823, the Monroe Doctrine and the Foundations of American Foreign Policy. That's July 20th, followed by the Second Great Awakening on August 3rd. We also have a parallel series of webinars on the Great American Novel. And we will be having our next one on that one on August 10th. That's going to be on Rip Van Winkle and Sleepy Hollow, Washington Irving. So please, we're going to be having a good summer of American history and American literature. Please come and continue to watch. And just again, thank you so much again for participating, all of you. And thank you to our audience for coming and listening.